And this next plenary will be discussing community resilience and growth stories. So I want to welcome you back. And what we're going to do for this last session is start off by watching a 20-minute video that has been sent to us by our colleagues and friends in Christchurch, New Zealand. And it's on community resilience and growth stories, a panel discussion.
So you will have picked up by now that the theme for our hui over the next 2 days is valuing inclusion, resilience and growth. And with me on the stage we have a fantastic panel of people, all leaders in their own right, with a very diverse range of experiences and perspective relevant to this. The reason, as was alluded to, the reason we're here in Otatahi, Christchurch, is pretty apparent, I think, even though it's now a few years on from when we first planned to meet here. It's still very much a place that is going through a lot of regrowth, and I'm sure that resilience and inclusion have been very central to some of that. Certainly people here, I think, know as much as anybody about what it is to live through traumatic events. Three of our panel, Dean, Ruth and Carolyn, all hail from Christchurch and have first-hand experience of events such as the earthquakes and the mosque attack, as well as leading and supporting others through and since these events. And Manasi and Tom are leaders too, and they've supported and led their communities both here and in Australia through COVID, and in Manasi's case, the recent Tongan volcanic eruption. So let me introduce them just a little. So Dean whakapapas to Ngāti Porou and Ngāti Hei. He's held a number of national lived experience mental health and addiction roles and is currently the Māori lived experience advisor for Te Aka Whaiora. He was a member of the National Mental Health and Addiction Inquiry team that produced Te Awa Oranga. So please welcome Dean to the stage. Ruth Jones is co-founder of the Christchurch Earthquake Disability Leadership Group, now called Disability Leadership Canterbury, and she tells me she keeps hoping there'll be a reason to disband that group, but there keeps being reasons to keep it going. She sits within Whānau Ora and is a social worker and has been honoured, deservedly so, for her ongoing leadership and transformation work in the disability sector. Carolyn is a psychiatrist and associate professor with expertise in anxiety disorders and disaster recovery, having led planning and implementation of the psychosocial responses after the 2012 earthquakes and the 2019 mosque attacks, and still continues to be involved in research with some of those people affected by the mosque attacks. Carolyn. Tom is a Kamilaroo man from Gunnedah in New South Wales, and he's the inaugural CEO of Gaia Duai, a Proud Spirit Australia, I think is the English name. He's held and holds a number of state and national roles in mental health and addiction, working to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people. And last but by no means least, I'm proud to introduce Manasi, because he works for me. Manasi is proudly Tongan with the chiefly title of Pakalau. He's led efforts to mobilise his community here in New Zealand to get vaccinated during the COVID pandemic, and he continues to lead local efforts to respond to the Tongan eruption. So I'm going to start with you, Dean, and wondering if you can take us back. I know it's more than a decade ago, but can you talk to us a little bit about how the earthquakes impacted on you, what it was like?
Yeah, so first of all, I want to acknowledge Te Pou and also Mana Whenua, appropriately welcoming us here in acknowledgement of Ru Whenua, which talks about the earthquakes that occurred in 2011, and also mentioning to Robin and Brian, great to see you. And thank you to International Initiative for Mental Health Leadership for acknowledging the Christchurch earthquakes on Tuesday, 22nd February 2011 at 12:51. People's lives changed forever. 185 people were killed, 1,500 to 2,000 injuries, causing destruction and devastation widespread throughout Christchurch. 12,000 aftershocks with over 30 stronger than magnitude 5 experienced through the earthquakes saw our town of Christchurch for that moment in time in a state of shock. We were paralysed. It was gridlock. It was chaos. I saw death because I had to make my way home from where I was at a netball venue, where I saw poles going from left to right, hitting the ground, and the netball ground looked like a wave. So when you see that, you think, you are paralysed. You are in this place of fear, and you're stricken with fear, and you're scared. And so these are real emotions that I don't want to talk about me. I want to talk about we, as the people of Otatahi who had to endure and live that. And adjacent to that, seeing injury, seeing people screaming from the top of their buildings because they had no way of getting out. They were trapped. Liquefaction, I've never seen bubbling water before, whilst trying to get to family because of the very fact that cars couldn't move anymore. So I ran and I ran. And then adjacent to that was trying to get to the family and seeing those things where people were lying on the ground with cloths on there, the chaos, the screaming. And you no wonder why people were frightened and anxious and hypervigilant and had disturbed sleeping patterns, because that's exactly what it was. Because of the worry and fear that strickens you and actually just grabs you. You can't sleep. It's impossible. If anything, it's broken. But there was rental significant damage to the house and context I was living in. And I ended up living in the garage, no power, no radio. But yet, Naho Wha, which is a marae, gave me a key so I could use their showers and kai. By then, my father and family had left. I had 2 autistic children. They needed their dad. I had a partner, and they left. And they moved away to Picton. Do you know what that's like? It's like a detachment trauma. And so I go back into my cave because that's what it felt like. And then within that, I carried on with my mahi aroha to the people within mental health and addictions, because I work for Canterbury District Health Board. So we got out that register of all our whānau who had mental health and addiction problems, and we went and seen each of them. And you thought I was bad? That's nothing. What I saw when I entered into some of those houses was broken sewage pipes, no TV, no radio, no transmission, nothing. These are people who are debilitated by things like panic attacks, anxieties, mental health, addictions, health and disabilities. Those are all the marginalised groups. But we went out to them. It shocked me. And what I love about Otatahi is mana whenua was whakatauaki, arawa ki te tangata. Underneath that is manakitanga, which is to care and to support people. It's a proverb from Naitahu that I've lived by, as a visitor coming into this rohi, into this takiwā, as a Ngāti. Māori were using their own culture to cope with the effects of rū whenua, the earthquakes. There was diverse community-led initiatives, community resilience and community-led disaster management that was being led out from the maraes. Tamariki children experiences during the Christchurch earthquakes, observing parents' anxiety, stress, trauma, and engendered loss, house and content, and loss of income is trauma. And if you think it ends back then, no. It transpires 5 to 10 years later. And so for me, the chronic stress, worry and heightened anxieties and feeling insecure and the emotional difficulties and increased stress levels and the grief and loss that those families had to endure because of the 185 lives that were lost And I've got to say, and I'm going to leave it at that, because I want to actually touch on humanity and actually what I saw. And humanity looks like this, and this is what I observed and seen. Who are we as human beings if we ignore the suffering of others? So what I saw in people's plight to help others, when they were suffering, they were helping people that were actually worse off. We rise by lifting the others in need of help and support. Kindness is the best form of humanity. And so I saw iwi tribes, North Island ones, travel down to Christchurch to provide help and support to registered Māori on their list. Many Māori of Christchurch do not whakapapa back to the local maraes. Marae were open and supported with essential supplies and resourcing from Naitahu, Māori organisations, Māori wardens, Māori Women's Welfare League, Māori response to community disaster management, Māori cultural approaches and responsiveness, whānau ora workers, Māori disaster resilience, because that's what we end up being. Does absorbing the worst effects of a disaster exhibit some degree of resilience? We need to ask that question of ourselves. And Māori on using their own culture to cope with the effects of rūwhenua. And what I saw lastly was diverse community-led initiatives, community resilience, that brought us back here today. And I wanted you to feel and sense what that was like for a lot of us as the people within Otatahi Christchurch.
Got it, Dean. Ruth, your own experience.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi matua. He horori ki te rori ki te atua, he mai ngā rongo ki te whenua, he whakaro pai ki ngā tangata katoa, tēnā koutou. He uri ahau no ngā tiparau, me rongo whakata, kia ora. I'll just slide that up so it doesn't play. So I think, look, I really honour your kupu matua. I'm here because I'm here in this space, I suppose, in the Wairua that I'm in, because my husband Gary and I were lucky to be at home. And probably the initial things we thought of were our staff. And it's a bit of a selfish thing, because we know that if we look, it's a bit like the manaakitanga thing, if we look after the people that support us, they will continue to support us. So our home wasn't affected, but being in Papanui, which is a wee way out of town, we didn't know what was happening. I really want to honour the mumai that was impacted in the earthquakes, like Dean said. I'm aware too, and I say this with love and respect. My husband is a cool man. A lot of you may know Gary. Before his time with national and international disability stuff, he created the software that measures earthquakes. So yeah, so I'm mihi to Gary for that, and hopefully we won't get another earthquake that can measure significantly. But he did create GeoNet, so he is very he's very conscious that's his wee contribution to knowing where we are at. But no, we certainly thought of our support staff, and we certainly wanted to give back. But on the day, look, we didn't know what was happening because we were safe in our whare, and we're conscious about the other people that need to get us up the next morning. It's that simple, I think. So I'll leave it at that. But knowing, I suppose, even from those first few weeks, that we needed to stand up and make sure that there was a disability voice in the recovery and rebuild of Christchurch. I think of a man, Karim, who is a disabled leader in Christchurch, and him walking home from the DPA office, Disabled Persons Assembly office, and being no longer in office.
Yeah.
So I knew that we needed to collect together really soon, which we did. Kia ora.
You've both alluded to the importance of Māori values, and also, Dean's alluded to that it helped to help others, you know, who were worse off than you, and also the iwi, the community response, and even from people in the North Island, you know, from far away. Are there other things that stand out to you that really helped in terms of the getting past it and moving on, you know, the recovery side, the resilience part of it?
Can I say something really quickly?
Yeah. I'm asking you anyway.
Oh, look, I think disabled, so if I stick to my lane, I know that disabled people are resilient. And I know that because we've just had the inquiry into abuse and care, and I know that we survived that. So I think I know that we're resilient. I know that we're at risk, but I know how flexible and adaptable we are as a community. And I think that if we are enabled to be together and virtually or whatever, and enabled to be our true selves, I think that we can in turn support others. So I knew all along that disabled people were resilient, and I think that's what drew us forward into creating a different space for us. But yeah, I think the innate belief in manaakitanga, what I saw with Ngāi Tahu, what I saw with Mātāwaka, what I saw with disabled people, I think, so we before we became what we became, which we can talk about later, as a rōpū, we did a barbecue for people in the east. So it was disabled people helping Māori and other people in the east of Christchurch. And that wasn't for us, because a thing that someone said to me really early on is disabled people need to contribute, and I knew this. Disabled people needed to contribute as well as receive. So I think there needs to be manaakitanga reciprocity for us to be a community. So if we are enabled to be a community as a rōpū, then it bodes really well for the future.
Dean, was there anything you wanted to add in terms of that, what you learned from it, what worked, what helped in terms of the moving forward after such a terrible traumatic event?
Well, what I learned was identity and whakapapa, and actually having a belonging. And so when the Ngātis actually come down from up north and knocked on my door, where I was isolated, feeling lonely, I was actually really scared and frightened. But I had to just contain that and carry on with my mahi with the Canterbury Health Board. But to be given a generator, to be given kai and all that kind of thing, I then jumped in the car, chucked a few of the bros in there, because I'm from A-Town, from Aranui, and we got pulled over by the police, and actually these police were from Australia. Oh, what are you doing with the knives? What's these bags in that for? So simply it was because I was going to go out and get some watercress. And so there was a New Zealand policeman there, and he says, oh, where are you getting watercress? I said, not within the city, we've got to go out far. So that's exactly what we did. And the resilience for me, when we talk about that, you simply don't feel that resilience or even can comprehend resilience when a natural disaster occurs, and the impacts of that are rippling and far and wide. Resilience comes later, and you see the resilience in people who feel that they are less fortunate to people that are actually worse off, and so they go to their aid and their support.
Carolyn, when I spoke to you ahead of this korero, you talked to me. You said to me that sometime immediately after Christchurch and in the time that followed, there were some people for whom they didn't like the word resilience. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think we kept hearing, "Oh, Canterbury's so resilient," and it felt like we were being given a sort of stamp on our forehead, like you're doing really well, just carry on. And it wasn't like that, and it actually, well, personally, I found that really difficult, because resilience isn't a thing that you have and it's sort of stuck on your head, like you are resilient or you aren't resilient. You know, we go back and forth from that. We have different challenges that we face and how we respond to that, and different ways and tools that we use, much of which Dean and Ruth have sort of touched on, you know, like finding meaning in what we're doing. Like lots of people felt they really wanted to help other people and contribute, and it actually is a really helpful thing to do. I know personally it's kind of what kept me going. It was all feeling so chaotic and mad, but you know, to carry on going to work and having that structure and feel that you're helping is really useful. And we know that finding meaning after events like this and helping people, as Dean was saying, you know, the value of kindness and the connection that you feel with other people. And look, in research terms, they talk about after disasters, there's a sense of honeymoon period or community cohesion where people do feel more connected than they've ever felt before. You could ask absolutely anything of anyone and you would help, and they would help you, just like we've been hearing about. And it was an amazing feeling in the midst of all this horror and chaos and ongoing fear that you could reach out to anyone and feel that they would help you. So it was a really, you know, horrible, but at the same time, you know, much more connected way of being than is in normal times. And I think some of the challenges have been to try and maintain that. So I was just thinking about that across services. You know, we came together in a much more joined up way than I think we've ever done before. You know, everyone was at the table, everyone's voice was valued and heard, and it was, and we heard about this from Minister Little, doing things together is just so much more powerful than how we tend to do things, which is in little silos and not doing it in a joined up way. So there are many learnings from it, but I mean, I think all of us would say it's probably some of the hardest work we've done, but some of the most valuable and the privilege to have done that work as well.
Have you seen similar lessons, I guess, similar things that we can take from the work that you're doing and the people you're working with who've been involved with or touched by the mosque attacks?
Yeah, I mean, there are similarities with disasters, but there are also some unique differences. So some of the similarities are, you know, those acute responses, like Dean talked about and Ruth, that sense of shock and fear that you're living in, which goes on for a long time. This isn't an event that then stops. I mean, after the earthquakes, there were, you know, the multiple aftershocks over 2 years, where every time there was an aftershock, it felt like it was about to happen again. So you're getting constant reminders. But in addition, and again, Dean and Ruth have touched on this, the secondary things that happen, you know, with people having no homes, no food. After the mosque attacks, it would be, you know, financial issues, immigration issues. They all layer on top of each other. And they're called the secondary stressors of traumatic events. And for many people, they become almost as big as the event itself. And so there are differences in what those secondary stressors might be. So for the mosque attacks, they've been different from after the earthquakes. I mean, of course, there are many unique differences after the mosque attacks, the cultural involvement and how we can help and do things in an appropriate way, which has been very challenging and really shown how little we have done that before. And I know it's like relearning from, you know, experiences that we should have, and we've had to relearn that again. And hopefully trying to do things as flexibly and making things as adaptable and accessible, you know, because if you keep things in silos, they're not accessible. You know, we have to break down those silos and do things in different ways.
We want to thank our counterparts in New Zealand for this panel discussion, for sharing with us. Gwain and Deluisi Jenna Warapixi Una Maki Mig Maki. Hi everyone, my name is Jenna Robar. My roots are in Cape Breton, land of the fog, Nova Scotia in Canada, known as Mi'kmaq. Rich and I wanted to share some reflections on the video with you folks and really hear what you thought as well, so I hope you're paying attention. So we heard a lot of different themes here, and first of all I want to say, you know, how glad I am that we are able to speak on topics of trauma, on topics that are sometimes heard of as being unspeakable, right? We're giving a voice to that and we're allowing space for that because we know what happens when we keep that inside. As individuals, as family members, as community members. So I just wanted to say thank you for this platform, for folks to be able to have the space to speak. And what I thought of was something that, I don't know if you caught it, that Carolyn said, you know, after a disaster happens, after something tragic happens, trauma happens, communities tend to come together. They come together. She called this a honeymoon phase, if you caught it. And for me, I thought of, first of all, social determinants of health, which is something we're all familiar with in this room, I think. And that ability to really come together and enter into this honeymoon phase is something that, in my experience, you're only able to do if you haven't been under extreme stress, if you haven't been living in poverty, if you haven't been living in extreme sickness, medical conditions. It really is an ability to have that space coming from somewhere where you're not already drowning, already grasping for air, for straws. And it's something that I think of, this concept, it's called Edawaptamuk, and it comes from my language. It comes from one of the elders on the island where I come from. And it's this concept of two-eyed seeing, if you've heard of it before. Anyone heard of Edawaptamuk? Two-eyed seeing? Pretty good, Rich. And hearing from my team over on this side of the room, hearing from Carol, who spoke earlier, really got me thinking about this session and resiliency on this topic. When we talk about resiliency, you know, I often hear Indigenous peoples are so resilient. Black people are so resilient. This group is so resilient, and it's almost like it's a compliment, right? It's almost meant to be like a compliment. Like in the video we saw, you know, it's like a stamp, you are resilient. But often it downplays the systems of oppression that brought upon this resiliency, or the tragic event, the hurt, the healing that has to come from that event or these events over hundreds of years. And it downplays the real root of it, the real system, and the systems that are being upheld today in colonization, the word we use today. And it brought me back, Rich and I were talking earlier, and it brought me back to months ago when I was on Facebook and I saw a post and it says, I don't want to be called resilient anymore. I don't want to have to be labeled resilient anymore. And it made me think of our communities and who would rather be gardeners, who would rather be seed savers, and who would rather be soft and peaceful and not have to fight so hard and not have to be called resilient. And you know, we would rather be healthy and happy and thriving. We'd rather have healthy connections. And really, we want to be part of change to create systems where we do not have to be called resilient. And I think I'll leave it there. Rich, tell me your reflections. What did you think of the video?
Thanks, Jenna. Similarly, I think you asked the question when the video ended, what did you think? And there was pretty much stunned silence for a few moments. Mm-hmm. And I felt the same way when I previewed it earlier today. And it just kind of had this rush of emotions from all types of trauma I'm sure that most of us in the room have experienced. In my life, you know, I'm old enough to have been there for 9/11 and the towers coming down. I grew up 10 miles from there, and from a street nearby my home, you could see the towers every day. And the stories that have evolved in my life and my career now have evolved into my work with the veterans in the United States. And Brian didn't elaborate, but I work with the Department of Veterans Affairs, but I work primarily on special initiatives with veterans with post-traumatic stress, spinal cord injury, traumatic brain injury, who have had traumatic events in their lives that led to where they are today and what they're trying to do with their lives today. So every comment that I heard in the video just kind of, I kept reflecting, because my job is actually meeting with and interviewing many of those veterans. So literally over the past 15 years, I've probably interviewed 500 veterans with one of those challenges in their life. And resilience comes up a lot. And to your point about, being labeled as somebody who's resilient or not comes up a lot in the military. People say, how come some percentage of people come back from these horrible war in theater and see horrible things, and they can come back and live a successful, vibrant life. And then others are just paralyzed. And Dean, I think in the video, talked about the paralysis that he felt and others around him felt in those early days and weeks and months. And we have some of the veterans I meet that I see that and I hear that in their voice, in their actions, and their inability to take the next step forward. The one difference, though, because now doing this for 10 years and sometimes seeing that same veteran 2 or 3 times over the course of years, is the comment about community and how community plays a role in that. That some folks have people around them that at the point of their trauma or their traumatic experience started to disappear. Friends, colleagues, military buddies, men and women, would no longer contact them as much because it was harder to engage and interact. Family members were more or less there because you're family, but they weren't as engaged because they didn't know how to deal with the emotions you're feeling. And I just, all these different takeaways came out of this, and there were several in particular that I think talked about the power of the community rallying. No matter who you talked to after that traumatic event, people were willing to help. And what our life experiences have been with 9/11, with the New Zealand experience, with hurricanes and tornadoes. We talked about the hurricane that went through Canada. By the way, it started in Georgia, where I live, and went all the way up into Canada. And then recently in the US, Southwest Florida had the Ian thing that just flattened communities and destroyed their lives in a matter of seconds. We all rallied at those first moments of that trauma, but then months go by and we seem to lose it. And I think maybe the role of IIMHL, IIDL is to help kind of reflect back on that in our organizations that we work with, to say, how do we sustain that? Maybe it's a question of sustainment, of that feeling of community that is so powerful. And before we run out of time, there was a comment on our chat, and it was a different question from this, but how do we build more community-informed practices into mental health treatment in addition to evidence-based and evidence-informed? Interesting concept, because I deal with evidence-based practices in my work all the time, and we think it's the great salvation of some of the challenges that people have, but ultimately it's not sustainable. Unless our family and friends start to circle around us again, we're going to have that feeling of isolation, of loss, that just doesn't allow us to live a full and vital life. So those were a couple of other thoughts that I had in addition to what you did. And by the way, I'm just getting to know Jenna, and I think she's going to be a superstar in our community here. I'm an old dog now. I'm going to be 70, so we need people like Jenna and many of the people in the audience here to keep the momentum going. We wanted to, do we have time, a couple more minutes? Just to get some other reflections from the audience, and let me grab a mic because I'm sure all of you have many thoughts about this topic as well.
Hey, my name is Brian. I come down here from Vancouver, Canada. I work for the Atlas Institute for Veterans and Families. Served 19 years in the Canadian Army. So resilience, knowing that I stand between people and being able to get out of here is a little risky to come up and talk about a topic this heavy. So I'll keep it as tight as I can. I'm going to talk about interpretations, not realities. In interpretations, there's a good side of resilience. When we look at one group of people that's got something that works and telling another and sharing that knowledge, that can help resilience. When we talk about the earliest interventions possible to stop a wound from becoming chronic, we're getting in the good side of resilience. Where I've seen negative is, institutions, if you say there's degrees of colorblind, well, they'll try weed some of that out. If you talk to them about diabetes, they'll say, well, you can or can't come in here. I fear, to some degree, if we put resilience in one of those categories, do we treat it, instead of sharing best practice, does it become barrier to entry, which is where I don't want us to go to. And then I guess with that is also looking at, is there a possibility to look at resilience and lead into victim blaming, like what's wrong with you for not being so resilient, as opposed to what can we do to help you in your resilience? Thank you both.
Great observations. And the other thing that struck me, I think, when Carolyn spoke is that resilience doesn't necessarily, it's not a static or a linear path. That it's different on different days and different months and different environments and different situations that you find yourself in terms of where you feel more comfortable or where you feel more vulnerable. And I thought that was powerful because I always thought of it as kind of this building blocks over time. But when I think back to people I've met, like yourself, that it really isn't that. It doesn't go in that path, all the time.
I think of what was coming to mind for me around hearing these stories and the burden of being labeled resilient is, and the comments that you just made about, can come and go. Like, what about thinking about one at a time resilient moments? Like, it's like you're going to have a the recovery is not about a cure. It's not about a fix. And so I can see the burden of being labeled resilient and how it holds, like it divides people as either resilient or not. And so just setting the expectations a little bit lower in recovery and in trauma-informed practice, you want little moments of recovery here and there, and to acknowledge that it's going to slip backwards. So you're not setting those expectations too high.
Absolutely. The other thing about, again, the video is very powerful in my mind. You didn't need Jenna and I. You could have listened to that, and we kind of had drinks and had a good time tonight. But to have your reflections on the points that jumped out at you is really, really important and valuable. There was one thing that I think got said, too, in terms of bring meaning back to life. Again, I don't know about that gentleman, but the veterans I've met who have really transformed their lives developed a new mission. They found a way to give back to the community and make a contribution again. And it was really healing in so many different ways in terms of their trauma experiences. We had a question here, and then I'll get back there.
Well, as we talk about the word resilience, one thing that comes to mind when you look at our society, and you hear people talk about promoting resilience, yet what do we do a lot? We overprotect people, whether both includes both people with disabilities and without. When we look at helicopter parenting, and yet young people, why do we have so many people in my generation? I'm a millennial, and my sister's generation Z that have issues with anxiety, depression, and what have you. It's because of it's because of all the outcomes of all the overprotection, and yet we get into the real world and we get a rude awakening, which is traumatizing. The whole stand on your own 2 feet mentality, which that everybody talks about. Yet what is all that helicopter parenting doing? We look at why do so many young people between millennials and have anxiety, depression because of helicopter parenting. We have puberty starting earlier as kids, which is also creating to the mental health crisis amongst the younger generation. And we, as a society, we need to stop with, mental health hush-hush. We don't talk about that. This pandemic should put an end to making disability, mental health, and put an end to stigma. You know, we're all going to become disabled before we die, whether we like it or not. We're not immortal. You're only temporarily able-bodied.
Thank you for that. That's kind of a personalized view on this. And again, it strikes me how much people don't talk about our family events and how we relate to losses in our families and who are our most important support people that help us make it through those difficult times. So how do we kind of bring community back into it again? We had a comment back here.
I'm probably going to say this same thing that maybe some others have said, but it's just in my own words, I guess. I really appreciate the comments that the two of you made. I just think it's so important to not skip over the pain and just look for the resilience. I'm recalling a time in high school when I looked like I was strong, and people were like, "You're so strong, and you just went through this thing, and you're so strong," and that gave me no room to not be, quote, strong. And so I felt like, this gentleman over here was talking about expectations, and it was a burden at that point that I felt no freedom for flexibility around what I was feeling. And I think it's so important as I believe you were talking about it, just having those, that's not linear, and to allow for that path and that growth without forcing it.
That's great. I reflect back as you're talking. My brother died at an early age in his 20s, and it was kind of a shock to the system. And I was strong during that period. I felt like I had to be strong for the rest of the family. So I kept plugging along until Ruby and I got together, and she made me cry like a baby some years later, and processing that. I think I want to grab him, and then I'll come back to you.
Your comments about seeking purpose and having some meaning in life, I wanted to just make a brief comment, particularly in light of the discussions that we're having here centered around indigenous wisdom. Many folks in the Anglophone tradition probably know of Maslow's hierarchy. An interesting fact about that I think has been obscured in history is that he developed that triangle working with Blackfoot tribe in Montana. And interestingly enough, he neglected to add the final part of the triangle, which is that there is no summation of self-actualization. That is only the second step to the top. The top step is to become a member of the community and to be a valued member of the community. And I think a lot of what we are talking about when we're talking about resilience, I'm going to use a term here, it's what the political construct of neoliberalism has pushed to the end, which is that we are all individuals separated from each other, only interested in our own pecuniary interests. And that obviously is a dead end. And we've heard that all day. What we actually need to be is human beings who are all working together to make everybody flourish. So the goal isn't to be resilient. The goal is for all of us to find a way to personally, collectively flourish. And I think that may be some indigenous wisdom that we should hold on to.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you just pass the mic right there?
I plan to say something very similar to what Ken just mentioned about my reflections watching the video, seeing how both of those people who spoke were in positions where they were helping others. And from that vantage point, things look very different. The key word here is purpose. That they were involved in something that was meaningful. And I think the question about takeaway for leadership is how can we put more people into that space? There's a need for connection. And a lot of the research around how to create social connection is around volunteerism. How do you get communities to connect to each other by helping each other? When we can create that shift where people are not thinking about the problem that they're facing, and they are facing problems, but they can find solace as well in helping others and kind of shifting that focus on how they can contribute rather than just be in that place of pain and suffering. I think that would be a big part of that. And we do see it was mentioned about the honeymoon phase after a crisis, where people do come together. And I think we should think about how we can systemize that in a more long-term way, where it's not just a response to crisis, but this is a modus operandi. This is the way people are functioning as contributors to society, not just takers.
I think it's also important to remember, as people with disabilities, even leaders need support at times. Because a lot of times people always say you have to be strong, you're the role model. They put that into your mind. You shouldn't have to ask for help. You know, you've been through all these things. You should be the strong person. And I think one of the biggest things is people always say you have to be independent. Well, nobody's independent in their life. Everybody has supports, everybody has needs and wants, just like everybody else. And so we need to teach people how to be interdependent and to talk about it's okay to ask for support. It's okay, even if you are a leader, to sometimes rely on somebody else to help you. And to, when you're going through those times, to be able to speak up about that and do that. Because part of the time, people with disabilities then think they have to be strong all the time. And they can't ask for that help, especially when they're seen as a leader. So we have to make sure that people also see people as people, and to say it's okay to ask for support when you need it. And it's okay to think about being interdependent. And a lot of times when we teach, we say, you know what, even the President of the United States needs help at times, so that it gets to people to see that they see that person as big and powerful and as a leader, that they understand then that they need help too at times, and they ask for that, and they don't do all that stuff by themselves, so that other people then will be like, oh, it is okay to see the other role models saying, I need support too. So we need to make sure that people with disabilities learn that and share that with other leaders, that it is okay to ask for support when you need it.
I think after coming out of now 3 years of a global pandemic, and that we universally around the globe have experienced the same thing of isolation and loneliness and disconnected from people who are important to us on a day-to-day basis, that this might be a window of opportunity to really kind of sound that alarm about how do we sustain that, you know, going forward for everybody, not just, you know, the people who can go back to their lives again, but the people who have been left out of that interconnectedness.
That's right. I'm hearing some themes here, Rich. I'm hearing some really good themes. And I wanted to share a little story on resilience that I've seen pretty recently. Everyone knows Hurricane Dorian a few years ago, 2019. I went to the Bahamas for a month to do post-disaster work with an organization called Global Medic. And I saw devastation everywhere I looked. No one had furniture anymore. The water was 22 feet high, 22 feet high. Houses were washed away, furniture was completely washed away, or, you know, put out on the street because it started to mold and they couldn't have that in their homes, along with the walls. Family members were missing. Houses were gone, cars were gone, a lot was gone. There's no grocery stores that were open. There was no clean water for a long time. And I remember we were working out of a church, and I asked one of the elders in the community, why are you here? Like, why do you keep going? Why do you keep showing up and handing out these donations with us every day? Why do you do it? If you're home, you have to do so much to your home, you have to rebuild everything. And she said, this work with community keeps me going. That's why you see everyone here. This is the only thing we got.
So just to add on to what the other woman said at the table about not being afraid to ask questions when it comes to people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. But I also want to shine a light on, I'm not gonna say for me, but it's very hard to, ask for help when, in society, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are looked on as when we ask for help is either we're complaining or we just don't want to do the work. But I understand where she is coming from a lot. So, yeah, don't be afraid to ask for help, but it's also a very sticky situation when you, as a person with a disability, go to someone or a work person say, I need help with something, then they probably look at you and say, oh, he's just complaining, or he doesn't want to do the work, or she just, to not use this word, but lazy or don't understand. But yeah, that's all I kind of wanted to add.
I don't know about you, Rich, but I heard some themes.
Lots of themes.
I heard some themes.
I'd like to, wonder about your thoughts about this, because I work in bureaucratic systems, both with Department of Veterans Affairs and with Department of Labor, workforce development systems, and I'm coming away with some ideas to kind of bring up the chain with those folks that I work with on a day-to-day basis. Just concepts of resilience, concepts of growth, concepts of engaging community more actively on the front end of services. What about you?
Absolutely. I work a lot in community. That's a title I carry, and I don't carry it lightly. Community is what we have, right? I can think of folks now who don't identify with community, who were disconnected by one way or another, and who really aren't doing well. You can tell when you're connecting with community, when you show up to programs or to volunteer or with your groups and community, you feel that. You feel that connection. My mom isn't listening, but my mom is someone who was disconnected from community and who deeply feels that sense of like isolation and like almost cold. So when I hear folks talking about the value of community, the value of sharing culture and bringing folks together, and what this means to a theme as resilience, it really makes me feel like there's hope. Feel like there's hope and feel like there's support there for every single person. We heard from a lot of diverse voices today, and it really gives me that sense of whoever you are, you have community and you have support. So that's something that I'm coming away with today and really pleased to say.
And it was actually one of the reasons Jenna and I spoke about keeping us all together instead of breaking into breakout on table discussions, because you all contributed just amazing insights to this.